All right. Well, thank you very much to everybody for attending this really important presentation on building the e-commerce dream team. I'm really excited to be joined by our guest today, Keith Anderson, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But let's take a look at the agenda for what we're going to talk about during our time together today. Great, so we'll go through introductions, then talk a little bit about the state of e-commerce in 2019, just to level set, and then we'll talk about the dream team that you need, which is the meat of the presentation today, what skills you should be looking for in your own team. Number 5 is a question that we often grapple with as we run marketing organizations, which is, do you go outside the company to hire experienced people, or do you train folks internally, and how would that work? And I know Keith's got a point of view on that. And then we'll wrap up with some additional resources so that you know what you can do next. So on the next slide, we'll do some introductions. Here's a picture of me. I'm Steve Gershik. I'm CMO at inRiver. I've been in B2B technology marketing for about 20 years. So around the birth of the commercial internet was my first marketing role. And so I guess I've grown up as a professional digital native, although these days we're hiring employees who have been digital natives their entire lives. And here's Keith's background and a photo of Keith. And I will say, welcome, Keith, and maybe say a few words about yourself.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks to inRiver for inviting me. I'm Keith Anderson. I lead strategy at Profitero. We offer e-commerce analytics for brands. Currently, we monitor and analyze Amazon and 8,000 other e-commerce retailers around the globe. Before joining Profitero 5 years ago, I led a consultancy for manufacturers and brands focused on the intersection of technology with retail, consumers, and brands. And this topic of how to build a high-performance organization is one that is a perennial favorite. I used to run what were called share groups of non-competitive manufacturers that would get together every 3 months to talk about challenges and opportunities that they shared. And somehow at every meeting, what team structure was ideal was always on the agenda. So happy to contribute to the discussion today.
Great. And on the next slide, let's talk about the state of e-commerce in 2019. We just released a new report, some original research, and a lot of what we're talking about during this webinar is based on Profitero's research, and so I'm really interested in hearing your insights, Keith. But in our just released Turning Browsers into Buyers report, we shared new research on the changing buying habits of this new generation of buyers. So I was talking about digital natives. Now we learned some interesting new trends on Amazon, on v-commerce, on voice commerce, e-commerce today, and what's projected for tomorrow. This gives information on e-commerce sales worldwide from 2014 to 2021. A couple of years ago, sales worldwide amounted to $2.3 trillion, and retail revenue is projected to grow to $4.88 trillion in 2021. One of the things that was noted in this survey was the top 3 online stores revenue amounted to almost $100 billion just a couple of years ago. Keith, what's your perspective on the momentum of these numbers?
I think most people are familiar with the concept of the law of large numbers, which sort of dictates that the bigger a given sector is, there's a natural tendency for growth to decelerate. What I think has been fascinating about e-commerce is, for as long as I've been studying it, maybe 15 years, almost like clockwork, e-commerce has grown in most mature markets at around 15% year over year, which is 3.5 or 4 times the growth rate of brick and mortar, and it hasn't really decelerated. So it represents in most countries sub 10% of all sales, in a few a little bit north of that, but it accounts for between half and all of the growth in many markets. So the mandate, if you want to grow, is to be present in e-commerce.
You know, one of the things that that we're always talking about at conferences and with our colleagues are key drivers of growth. On the next slide, you know, the growth in the rate of change. I know just a couple of years ago it was 8.8% of total retail sales. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear some of your perspectives on the key drivers. I know that we talk a lot about changes in the growth of third-party logistics, explosion in the growth of mobile internet penetration, allowing more and more unbanked shoppers access to e-commerce, certainly the growth of big data. What are some of the other drivers that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think you hit on a few of the big ones. Just the widespread access of broadband internet and smartphones, and the ability to display really rich and detailed information about products, including consumer-generated content like product ratings and reviews, has been one of the biggest drivers. And to your point, Steve, about digital natives, I think as you look at the cohort of shoppers that are entering what I often think of as the high consumption life stage, you know, they're getting married, they're buying homes, they're starting families. That generation grew up with technology and has the expectation that if something's available to buy, they can find it, learn about it, and buy it online. And so as that generation enters that high consumption life stage, they're already predisposed to researching and shopping online, and naturally their consumption is already disproportionately online. On the supply chain side, I was happy to hear you mention third-party logistics. I think most of what the industry has focused on for the last 2 decades is what I think of as the demand chain, all of the work that goes into attracting, engaging, and converting shoppers. And I see an immense focus now on the supply chain, essentially how products are manufactured, in what form, how they're warehoused, and how they're routed to stores and homes. And automation in the warehouse and even at the last mile, I think is going to fundamentally change the economics of e-commerce as a business model. And so, while there's a ton of great innovation on the demand chain still ahead, things like augmented reality and voice commerce, there's also some really interesting stuff going on behind the scenes, in a sense, that's really critical to the economic sustainability of this channel.
I saw a presentation at NRF recently about that was presented by a bunch of venture capitalists. There is a lot of investor interest in the area of reverse logistics, and one of the things that our Turning Browsers into Buyers report covered was how digital natives and Gen Y millennials are buying products online with the intent of returning them over time, and that it's really important to see some cost efficiencies in the area of reverse logistics.
Yep, totally agree.
So, so in case anyone on this call had any doubt as to the size of the market, the size of the opportunity, the acceleration of growth, I hope that we've proven to you that this is a big, important area. But the purpose of our chat today is really to talk about, well, what do you do on the supplier side? If you are the brand, if you are the retailer, what can you do? So on the next slide, let's introduce the topic of the presentation here, which is really about the dream team that you need. This is a really interesting quote here on the screen. Consumer habits are really changing faster, I think, than our ability to keep up. I noted with interest, there's a fellow named Scott Brinker, the chief architect, who publishes this marketing technology super graphic every year for the past 7 years or so. It keeps growing. This year, they've got over 7,000 different technology providers available to marketers. It is quite literally impossible for everybody to keep up, and consumer expectations are keeping up. So there's a great imperative for us to build high-performing teams that are capable of keeping up with consumer expectations. We just had at our Pinpoint event in Europe a couple of weeks ago, Brian Eisenberg, who wrote a great book about how companies can be more like Amazon. And he said that consumer expectations are not just comparing you to your competitors, but comparing you to the very best in terms of service, quality, convenience, and availability in the world. And so those expectations have never been higher. So on the next slide, this reminds me a little bit about when I got into marketing about 20 years ago, and there was a rise in these titles that we had never heard before: webmaster and SEO specialist and retargeting specialist, all of these new titles. Can you, Keith, reflect on some of these new titles and what's driving the need to hire some of these specialists?
Sure. Yeah, I think as you'll hear us go into detail in just a minute, we with our partners at Kantar Consulting have done now 3 consecutive years of studies on how companies are organizing in this space. And we use 2 methodologies. One, we surveyed in the most recent study more than 200 brands globally. And secondly, we essentially scraped the LinkedIn profiles of more than 7,000 professionals who in their title on LinkedIn have e-commerce in their profile. And the general trend is that as the stakes have gotten higher, the amount of dedicated support being allocated to this work continues to go up, and it's being dedicated really on 2 vectors. One is at a functional level, and that's really what I think you see reflected here. Most companies would have somebody responsible for things like merchandising or trade marketing in a brick and mortar sense. But as the workload has expanded and become more critical, we're seeing more and more dedicated headcount allocated to these functions purely in an e-commerce sense. So a content manager in this world is really somebody focused on product content, making sure that all of your content is complete and compelling. Do I have the right images, especially the primary image? Is the title representative of the specific item with the right product form and pack configuration and pack count and pack size, and especially any keywords that might impact my visibility in search results. Trade marketing refers to a discipline that's really common in brick and mortar, essentially marketing with and through the trade, and adapts it to the e-commerce context. So the big headline is that on a functional level, you're seeing dedicated specialists in these and other areas. And then we also are seeing, at the moment, limited to a handful of really critical e-commerce retailers, but more and more dedicated account level support. That is, if you're doing business with Amazon, just as you would with an omni-channel retailer like Walmart or Target or Home Depot, you've got an account team that is dedicated to that trading relationship. And we see dedicated e-commerce teams, including dedicated to certain e-commerce accounts, growing.
Noted with interest this e-commerce CIO, which is separate and discrete from a CIO. What's the difference between those roles?
Well, the interesting thing is when you dig into the role descriptions at different companies, it varies a bit, but it typically is an executive that's responsible for selecting, deploying, and managing technologies. Technologies that might be essential for doing business directly with consumers through your own e-commerce site, or technologies that help you do business with platforms like Amazon or Walmart or Jets or others. So it is a reflection, I think, of the level of executive endorsement and support that this area is starting to receive.
I'm really interested to see that there's the title of chief storyteller here. I'm starting to see more and more B2B companies hiring people with storyteller in their title, which harkens back to ancient times of selling and marketing and updating that for this new digital realm. So it's going to be interesting to see how the growth of that particular title and role in companies will develop over time.
Agree, and I think it's a reflection of some of the potential that the digital shelf represents for telling your products and your brand's story. The brick and mortar retail environment offers a lot of opportunity to represent the brand and build brand equity at the shelf through your packaging and some of the display opportunities in a physical retail environment. But unquestionably, e-commerce represents an opportunity to tell your story with richer media, high quality images, videos, increasingly 360-degree spin images, and more. And so that storytelling and narrative approach, I think, is really interesting.
Now, in your report, you had a profile of a successful e-commerce leader, somebody who serves to marshal the forces of the organization with those titles that we just saw. What do you see as the key attributes of that combination of skills and personality and affects experience and approach at successful companies?
I think it depends in large part on each company's culture and whether from the executive level on down, and that means the C-suite, the board, how ready are they to really transform the organization? But the profile that we've seen really succeed tends to be somebody that has a history in pioneering roles, maybe in a discipline like shopper marketing or another relatively new function inside of traditional manufacturers, which gives them the vocabulary to connect with their peers in other functional areas of the business. But they also have comfort with ambiguity, a willingness to roll up their sleeves and explore, to learn by doing, to continuously improve, which is sort of the mandate in this space. The only constant ultimately is change. And so this person has got to be somebody that's ready to embrace change and lean into it and bring the organization with them. As we'll cover when we talk in a few minutes about the train or hire or insource or outsource discussion, we've yet to find a company succeed entirely through outsourcing, and it's not likely that you can even hire everybody that you're going to need to really outperform. And so what you need in a functional leader is somebody who can persuade the entire organization and win the hearts and minds of people in traditional disciplines and functions to row in the same direction as the team that's dedicated exclusively to this channel. You can't do it alone. You're going to have to work with your colleagues in category management, R&D, supply chain, sales, marketing, IT, on down the list, finance. There's no corner of the organization that this doesn't impact. And so somebody that comes from a purely technology background has some advantages. They've got the vocabulary and the technical know-how. Where they sometimes struggle is in translating the technical to the commercial and being able to build the consensus across the organization that's really necessary to succeed.
So on the next slide, we've got a little more granular view of those key responsibilities. I'd love to hear you talk. This is from your report in what that leader needs to be thinking about and doing.
Yeah, I mean, to simplify it, this is really here for reference, but they will typically be responsible for what I think of as strategic decisions, which are really about where to play. Are we going to do direct to consumer or not? If this person has global remit, they will typically identify the countries that they want to focus on or prioritize. Within countries, the business models that are the best fit, and by business model I mean, one common example in our world is take a beer manufacturer as an example. Do they focus on third-party last-mile delivery networks like Drizzly and Minibar, which are really focused on their category, or do they focus on some of the brick-and-mortar retailers that also sell their category, among others? And often those decisions come down to affinity with your shoppers or desired shoppers and the economics of doing business with that type of trading partner. They also are often responsible for building the team. So this topic is top of mind for this specific executive role. They also, if there's not a dedicated CIO, they are responsible in most cases for building the toolkit. We see the same thing, Steve, that you noted from some of the conferences you've been at. We published a study called Building Your Digital Toolkit that identified more than 300 solutions, including Profitero and inRiver, in this broader ecosystem of technologies to help accelerate performance online. And so navigating that complex ecosystem is also part of this person's role. And finally, depending on the way they structure the teams, they are either responsible for managing many of the things that you see listed here, everything from launching products to maintaining performance for evergreen products to building merchandising and marketing plans, or if they don't own that work themselves, they're not doing the execution. They often serve as a center of excellence that establishes standards and leading practices that get distributed to the teams that often already exist to do business with those retailers. So if it feels like more than a full-time job, I think the people in these roles would probably agree. And it's a demanding job for which there's not an immense supply of experienced folks. So it also happens to be one of the hardest roles to fill. If you set as your prerequisite somebody that has done it for 5 or 7 years and can hit the ground running, there's only so many people with that level of experience in a domain that's still emerging as this one is.
Sure. So and I think that extends to other roles within the e-commerce organization too. So in the next slide, I think I want to get into talking about the skills that matter. within an organization, because even if you can find that unicorn leader on the next slide, then we can certainly say that they've got their work cut out for them in looking at the type of people and the type of skills that they need in order to be successful. I know in your benchmarking survey, you've got data analytics and insights as a key consideration. One of the things that's not specifically called out here, but I hear it quite often, is people who are expert in change management. And Keith, you were saying if you're not comfortable with change, then you're probably not in the right industry. You're probably not in the right role to be keeping up with customers and competitors the way that the market requires us to. But what are some of these other learnings from this benchmarking survey that you guys conducted?
Sure. Yeah. So this was in response to the question, in each of these areas, do you plan to hire in 2019 or not? And so some of what we see reflected here, I think, is clearly there's demand for folks to analyze the data that's available. One point of explanation might be that data is the lifeblood of how you perform in the channel, and I think that's true. We also think it's a function of the fragmentation of data that's available. That is, there are aspects of doing business online that are infinitely more measurable than doing business in a physical environment, but there are other aspects that are not as measurable. And so part of doing the work involves wrangling the various data sets, trying to synthesize and normalize them, and spending more time making good decisions and less time looking at the past to understand what happened. So we see a lot of growth in that area. Account management and sales is literally just the individuals and teams that are responsible for managing the business with retailers like Amazon. Content and digital merchandising is another one that we've seen incredible growth in. That refers to a dedicated role that produces and manages product content. So that whole work stream of identifying what content converts, either developing it in-house or with the help of agency partners, managing it centrally, syndicating it to all of your retailers, making sure that it was syndicated successfully, analyzing it for impact and effectiveness. That is increasingly a dedicated role. We have one large client that actually has more than 50 dedicated digital merchandisers that are assigned at the account level and literally spend their days, not unlike what a third-party merchandiser spends their time on in a physical environment, essentially ensuring that the digital shelf is optimized so that the right content is present in the right place every day. So you can see some of these other areas that are growing as well. I suspect that supply chain one, when we survey the industry again later this year, is going to grow again for the reason that I highlighted earlier. Many of these areas are all about how you attract and convert shoppers, but as the stakes continue to get higher, there's more and more interest in converting shoppers profitably, and that has big supply chain implications as well.
Sure, that's super interesting. You guys did another study from LinkedIn that I want to put up on the screen here on the next slide. You did a study of thousands of titles on LinkedIn on the organizational structure or the workforce makeup. What did you learn in this survey?
Sure. Yeah, and for those listening in, at the end of this deck, there's a link to download the entire study. So you'll be able to access the entire thing. This is a different lens on a similar question. So here, instead of asking the industry to tell us who do you plan to hire, we use LinkedIn as likely the best public source of intelligence on who already works in this domain. So as I say, we started by scanning LinkedIn for people at the 150 largest manufacturers who had e-commerce or some variant of that phrase in their title. And then we had a team go through and assign a role to each of those titles. And so channel management and account management are similar. Channel management refers to the executive teams or anybody that manages e-commerce broadly as a channel. So that would be anybody who's managing Amazon and Home Depot and Walmart, typically the VP or director of e-commerce. Account management is very similar, but focused on a specific account. Content and digital merchandising is, as I just described, developing and managing your product content through online retailers. And digital acceleration and innovation, which also is a pretty significant percentage of the workforce, is directly tied to that point Steve made about change management. This is actually a discipline that transcends e-commerce itself, but is usually used to describe a person, or in some large companies, a whole team that is driving the broad transformation of the organization. And that will mean everything from trying to make some cultural adjustments so that, for example, there's a greater tolerance for failure and a willingness to experiment, as well as project managing some of the specific initiatives, like if you're not already doing business with Amazon, getting that started, or if you don't already have all of the tools that you need, selecting and deploying those tools. I suppose relatedly, the other concluding point on this slide, you'll see that capability management in sort of a magenta over to the left. That is a function that is somewhat like the CIO, but explicitly responsible for selecting, deploying, and managing technologies. And we think, again, it's a reflection of the complexity of the ecosystem of tools and technologies that are out there in this area.
So it's more of a technology officer or information officer, but maybe not a chief information officer, somebody with that role specifically called out.
That's right.
So you teased before insource versus outsourcing, and whether you train somebody into one of these new roles or you hire somebody into these new roles. So I'm curious where in the organization you can look to train people into the new role, and how challenging is it to recruit experienced e-com people into those roles? Because I know when you've got new roles that are just emerging, like you said, finding somebody with 5 years or 3 years of experience who are interested in leaving their current role can be a challenge, and the demand is only increasing. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, it is definitely a challenging scenario, I think, for the industry at this point. In that LinkedIn analysis, year over year, we saw an 83% increase in dedicated headcount across all of these different roles. And we started getting the question, is that all net new, or are those people being reassigned from other functions? And there's a pretty significant percentage. We can't yet quantify it, but when you look at the profiles of folks in these roles, a significant percentage are being reassigned from traditional functions like account management for brick and mortar retailers, category management, shopper marketing, traditional finance or supply chain roles. Part of the challenge is that there are relatively limited options for really practical training to help accelerate the learning curve for some of those folks. We and again our partners at Kantar Consulting have tried to develop some training to serve the industry on that front, but there's no question that you're going to have to train some of your existing folks, and you likely will have to outsource some work, and you likely will have to hire. To your point, hiring is probably the biggest challenge. The people with experience are in significant demand, both at your direct competitors as a manufacturer, but also the ecosystem of technology companies surrounding this industry. And what that means is companies are having to revisit policies like, do we allow remote employees in some areas? Do we open an outpost in a big hub where the talent already lives and prefers to work? And outsourcing can be a great option to accelerate results when you don't have the time to build or train a team entirely internally. Generally, the guidance is not to outsource anything that you think has long-term strategic significance. It's very hard to get advantage if you're renting the same capability that your competitors can also rent. And so if you make the decision to outsource things like content development or search engine optimization, in this context, optimizing content for your placement in retailer search results, as we say, it's a great way to accelerate performance. Just be sure that you've got a transition plan in mind from the beginning, and that you're learning as much from your partner along the way as you can. So be sure that you establish weekly or every other week status calls. Ask as many questions as you can about what they're doing, why, how it's going, and have a plan eventually to ramp up and bring any of that mission critical work in-house. I do think as the technology continues to improve, it's getting more and more feasible in a lot of these areas to bring work either entirely in-house or to manage more of it in-house than was possible when almost everything required immense manual effort. Agencies by definition are people businesses. And so a lot of companies leaned heavily on agencies over the last 5 or 10 years. We think agencies still have a great role to play, especially at the frontiers where the work itself is evolving the most and is fuzziest. But if you really are committed to winning in the channel and you want a sustained advantage versus your competition, you do have to plan to bring the work in-house over time.
Yeah, great point. And to sum it up for people, I think there's no one right answer. So if you're looking for the answer, sorry to disappoint you. I think part of the reason for that is what you were saying, Keith, which is it is hard to predict what new innovative technologies are going to be core in the near term, the midterm, or in the long term. I started my career 20 years ago at a voice recognition technology company, and we were talking about v-commerce back in 1998, 1999, and we're just starting to see that become a driving force today with the rise of consumer expectations and voice-enabled devices in the home. So it's important to stay flexible, but have that plan. like you talked about. We uploaded some resources for you. On the next slide, there's a link to this. We'll send you out a link to the presentation as well, so you can grab these resources here on your screen on the next slide. Profitero study is a fantastic 30-plus page study, and we've got a piece of research that we published recently called Building the E-commerce Dream Team on the next slide. There are the links, and there were the links, and these are ungated. So thank you to the marketing teams of Profitero and inRiver for giving these assets away for free, and we will share these links with you in the future. We are right up against our time, but maybe we've got time for one or two questions here. So Keith, we have a couple of good questions, including one of my favorite questions. So thank you to whomever asked this question. What is the biggest mistake, Keith, e-commerce teams make today when building teams?
Oh, it's a good question. I think the biggest mistake actually has more to do with culture than structure. And that's usually how I start these discussions. What I mean by culture is it's a common pitfall to have one person or even one person with a dedicated team assigned to e-commerce, and you sort of wipe your hands and say, great, we checked the box, we're done. But to my earlier point about how integral the rest of what the organization is doing is to success in e-commerce, this isn't something that can be managed in a vacuum. It's something that needs to be aligned with and in lockstep with your broader go-to-market strategy, sales, marketing, finance, supply chain. And so if there's not broad-based, top-down support and endorsement for the channel, even hiring a world-class leader and having that leader build a world-class team sometimes doesn't move the needle because they're facing internal headwinds that are too strong. So my first suggestion is be sure that part of your overall plan is signaling really loudly and clearly to the entire organization that winning in this channel is critical to the company's overall success. And I think relatedly, hiring somebody that doesn't have the credibility to build that consensus and align the organization can be a pitfall. There was a brief period where we saw an influx of talent from Google, Amazon, and Facebook into big brands. And while there are a handful of examples where that was really successful, I saw more cases where those sort of purely technical folks were simply unable to navigate the organizations of large companies that have large, complex organizations that have opportunities and challenges that can't be solved exclusively through the lens of technology.
Right. So to restate that, what you said just beautifully is that you've got to have a culture within the company that welcomes change management, that welcomes agility, and will attract people who can move quickly, because even if they've got roles, historically in channel management, the rate of change is only increasing along with consumer expectations, and we don't see any signs of that stopping anytime soon. Keith, I want to thank you for joining me here today. We're plumb out of time. To those of you who submitted questions, I apologize that we weren't able to answer them here, but we've got your contact information. We will respond back to you directly. And for everybody else, thank you very kindly for joining us on this presentation on building the e-commerce dream team. This will be available on demand if you want to see it again or would like to share it with your friends or colleagues. So thanks for joining us here today, and thanks again, Keith.
Thanks very much. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.